Next topic is religion and antiquity, and this is connected to our universalizing theme of religions. So we're going to go through a few different sections for this. We're going to think about early religion, Roman religion. So early religion being the religion before monotheism for the most part. Roman religion because it's similar to Greek, similar to Norse, it's similar to Vedic religion. So there's a lot of similarities between it and many other places. Also, there's similarities to China even. Not because of connections, but just because of people in the ancient world. All of these things. And then we're going to look at universalizing of Christianity, and then we're going to look at Islam as universal religion, and then also the spread of Buddhism, as Buddhism had already been made a universal religion by Ashoka, but it's sort of the introduction to new places and how it's universalized for those places. Plus, we get a little history for Korea and Japan as well on that. So, a few things we have to think about. How do we define pagans and paganism, magic, and religion? So, first of all, I'll talk about this more in a second, but these are categories. Categories that were created much later after the period we're actually talking about, but they're also categories of identity based on the proper religion at the time, based on the dominant group. We want to be able to identify features of traditional religions, recognize the universalizing process in Christianity, Islam, and Buddhism, and perhaps note that there's many features in Christianity and Islam and Buddha, like all these religions that have aspects of traditional religions. And perhaps we should qualify the idea of a traditional religion, because traditional has a bad connotation to it these days. In ancient studies, it's not so much felt the same way as modern studies, but because many traditions are invented in order to control people still, or to get you to buy things is another aspect of that. But in this case, I don't want to use the word pagan religions because it's improper. It's completely wrong to use that. It's also derogatory for the most part, and I'm not trying to be derogatory towards any of the religions. So everything that we're going to cover is going to be based on looking at documents. What do the documents tell us, and what do we know about the histories of these things? So definitions, religion, pagans, and magic. We talked about this already. So first of all, we have a really broad definition for religion, a system of beliefs. The word religion comes from a word in Latin called religio, or the words religio. And it's related to the system, really the calendar of holidays and festivals in Roman religion. So in Roman religion, there'd be festivals every single month. Some months had, almost the entire month was filled with different kinds of festivals. And so you'd partake in the imperial festivals, but you'd also partake in, we'll talk about that in a little bit. So there'd be multiple pieces to religion. So the idea of religion's not, I don't want to use gods and God and afterlives because not everything has that. Not all religions have that necessarily. I don't think they need it even. So system of beliefs. How should we perceive the concepts of pagans and magic? Where do the terms come from is maybe the first thing we should think about. So the word pagan, automatically you think someone against Christianity or someone that doesn't do Christianity, but isn't that problematic? Because there's many people that don't follow Christianity that aren't religious at all. Are they pagans? Or is pagans people that follow, I don't know, multiple gods or do weird rituals in their house? So it's problematic. And magic also has similar problems because the way it's looked at now and even in the Middle Ages isn't the same on how it was looked at in the ancient world. And so we have to go back and break these down a little bit. So pagan, the word pagan comes from pagani. This is a plural. Paganus would be the singular. It's a negative term towards rural peoples, and essentially it's a word that means something like country bumpkin in Latin. So note that Christianity first spread into the cities and then outward from there. So this might be obvious why it would come about, but then again, the term was never used in that way until sometime between the 6th and 7th century, so the 500s to 600s CE. So essentially, this is the late antique or early Middle Age church that was doing this, and it was about power structure. So they're going after non-Christians because they're the dominant group, and they're creating categories for people's identities. So first of all, we should know that there is no unified paganism religion. There's no pagan religion. So there's no there's a lot of arguments in the late antique study about pagans versus Christians, and there's nothing like that that really takes place. So Christians in the early days, they go after other Christians more often. So when there's a standardized beliefs made, they're going to go after and crack down on heretics first. But people that don't believe in Christianity, I mean, they're still in the aristocracy and government for some time after this. So finally, the word magic, I mean, it comes from a few things. It actually has a long sort of path to being existing. But essentially, by the time of the Middle Ages, magica is the Latin word. It comes from the Magi, which is a priest of Zoroastrian priests. And so in Rome, and actually in the West, generally things to the east are always lesser. And this is kind of the idea of the magic term and why it's named after the Magi. But also, it became a category of bad religious practices. So it is a set of beliefs. And generally, it's a set of beliefs that involves medicine and sort of scientific things, but also daily life, trying to affect daily life. So a lot of times it has to do with healing, could have to do with competition, but it has a lot of different possibilities for what it's used for. So in some ways, its definition is very close to religion, but people that follow a certain religion might still do magic things, and they have a belief in this thing that can affect daily life. So there's a lot of purposes behind it, and it covers many categories, so it's really hard to define for those reasons, but for this purpose of this lecture, in this class, we might say that magic is simply a set of beliefs that are considered bad later on, but during the ancient times, it was there was categories of magic that mattered, and we'll talk about that in a little bit, actually. So, traditional religion and magic, I'm going to cover it all in one shot here. So far as traditional religion is concerned, and using Rome as a model for it all, there is, first of all, it's polytheistic, and there's many gods, tons of gods, but not everyone, spends all their time sacrificing each god. Some of them are state gods. Sorry. So some aspect of the personal part of religion, that's what I start off with here, are the Penates, the Lares, and part of the Lares is really ancestor veneration. So extremely important in Rome, something of glory of the family, and so tracking your family members and your hereditary position, all this mattered for your position in society. So patricians were people that could trace their lineage back to the foundations of Rome. So you're upper class if you can do that. You're lower class if you can't. So ancestor veneration is extremely important, but more important for people of wealth. Penates is the household gods, and so yeah, you have a separate set of gods for your household that you sacrifice to and ask things from. So prayer essentially is done to those gods more often than anything else. And then the Lares is like your household spirit. So the house has a spirit. This goes back to animism, and we talked about animism before. All religions have aspects of animism, and animism is sort of your original human religion, and it's found in every corner of the world. The Americas has it before connections are made. Europe has it. Asia has it. Africa has it. Anyway, so the other factor is that there's a strong belief in ghosts, essentially, or better to call them shades, or umbra, which means shade in Latin, or shadow. So they believe that if you died before your time was up, which was pretty much, could be like old age, like 67 years old, you wandered around as a ghost, and you're probably pretty unhappy, so you cause problems for the people living, essentially. People that die violently, not buried properly, all these things would lead to you being a ghost. Also, when it comes to magic and some of these curse tablet things that I actually studied, usually there's someone being brought back from even proper burial to being a corpse demon, essentially. So, not necessarily a zombie, but basically a ghost that does things for the person. Alright, as I mentioned, there's many gods. And all these gods, there would be a festival calendar that you follow. And so Saturn had Saturnalia during what we perceive as Christmas time, and really the 12 days around it, and it would involve many things that we don't do today. So a lot of these practices didn't make it past the Middle Ages; they were outlawed. But anyhow, it was important to early Christianity still. Also, the issues of imperial cult come up, and this is a big issue with Christianity, especially towards the Diocletianic persecutions. But everyone was required to sacrifice to the imperial cult. This is not during the Republic. This is during what we think of as the Empire. And this sacrifice to the imperial cult is to make sure the emperor has a good reign for the year. And if you refuse to do it, it would be essentially saying that you wanted to overthrow the government. And so this is part of the reason for persecutions, although the language for the persecutions comes from Christians. And so it's viewed differently if you view it through just Christian sources. But if you look at it through all the sources, you might be able to think about this in a different way, perhaps. We'll move on. So magic practices, some could include many forms. One form would be curse tablets, which I have an example over here to the right of a curse tablet. This curse tablet actually comes from Hadrumetum, which is the place that I did a study on. On the front side, there's a picture of some kind of, maybe a deity of some sort. I'm not really sure. There's no obvious answer to that. There's some weird words on his chest. There's a few other features that are odd. He's holding some kind of staff and something in his other hand as well. There's a series of words that look like gibberish, but perhaps they're actually names of maybe some kind of guardian spirits or other deities. But in the circled section, sort of like almost looks like a caption, it says something to the effect of the nighttime Tiber Oceanus. On the other side, they have a whole big inscription, what appears to be chicken scratch writing. It looks like there's some, perhaps, Greek script mixed with Latin letters as well into this. But adiutio te daemoni. So like there's a calling up a demon essentially. But in this case, the thing is, in the ancient world, the demon, the word daimon, which demon came from, doesn't mean the same thing as our modern word demon. So a demon back then would have actually been a guardian spirit and not an evil thing. Other forms, so curse tablets are usually used for binding spells to get a partner. I don't mean like a partner in business, but I guess they're sometimes referred to as erotic or love magic as well. They're also used for other forms of competition, to affect chariot races, to affect business, so on and so forth. Another form is pharmacon, which is where the word pharmacy comes from. So when you go buy get your prescription pills from the pharmacy, you're actually there would have been things related to that were magical back in the ancient world. So it's for healing, and it's taking a mixture of herbs or whatever their remedies were back then, but the remedies would include some kind of incantations with it. So in law, in the whole Mediterranean, magical intent seems to always matter. So something known as ars arcana, or the dark arts, or the arcane arts, is really what it translates to. This means that you have negative intent on the target. So these are actually illegal to do, and usually they're done at nighttime. Curse tablets were done at nighttime too, at least part of the process. And things done at nighttime are wrong in the especially the Roman world, but really the ancient world. In the 12 tables, really early on, there's actually laws against crop charming. There's actually a case that's preserved in writing about a guy that was charged with crop charming because his crops grew while his neighbors died. And so he was brought on charges for killing the crops of his neighbors through incantations and spells. But his defense was that he works hard and his neighbors did not. So take that how you wish. But there's a whole, this is like way too much. Like you can make a whole class about these sort of topics. So I just wanted to briefly cover them. If you have any other questions about these, you can always bring them up. So here's a few other binding spells that use a clay doll, and you stick nails in the various spots. The heart, the eyes, the mouth, the crotch, the rear, the back. So something like voodoo, I guess you could say, but there'd be incantations and a similar effect as a curse spell. So a lot of the curse or the binding spells say things like, don't allow this person to see others, speak to others, sleep with others, so on and so forth. And that's what that is relating right there. A lot of spells we have that are preserved are from something called the Greek Magical Papyri. Also, this book is translated in English. It exists probably in the library even. But also has demotic spells, which is a ancient Egyptian hieroglyphs written in a new form of cursive. And these weren't a single like spell book. They're from many spell books, and it just so happens that people that did, I should say archaeologists that did find these sorts of things, they would rip out sections, or people in Egypt would rip out sections and sell them to museums and universities. So they're found, pieces of these are found all over the world at various museums and universities. But Hans Dieter Betz put them all together into one book. Very helpful. Let's see. And here's a page from the PGM and the original language. So this is actually in Greek, and then it has a depiction on it. So this is the sorts of things that spells might have. A lot of writing within the figure as well. So let's move on to mystery cults. Something maybe you didn't expect to come up. Mystery cults are kind of interesting, but at the same time, there's not tons of information about them. Many of them we don't know anything about them, but a few that we do are the Eleusinian Mysteries and the Cult of Mithras. There's a Cult of Cybele. So the depictions here all have to do with these things. The the upper left one has to do with the Eleusinian Mysteries, which is a very popular mystery cult, and people talked about it even though they're not supposed to in their writings, so that's why we know something about them for the most part. We also found the spaces in which they did perform their rituals. The bottom two left side and the top right side all have to do with Mithras. And so Mithras is a Zoroastrian god that spread into Egypt. He took over the temple to the Apis bull in Egypt, and so his depiction of him slaughtering the Apis bull is part of his his formula, if you would. He's always wearing something that's known as a Phrygian cap. The Phrygians were in Anatolia after the late Bronze Age collapse. And Cybele was a religion that was taken from the east somewhere, probably in Anatolia, a really long time ago by the Romans. So it goes way back. But the cult would, I don't know, they castrated the members, the priests, and they're eunuchs. So eunuchs weren't really common in early Rome, but they would have been from this cult. So they were an unusual sight to see anyhow. So mystery cults all surrounded, everything surrounds a messianic figure. So in other words, a figure that's going to save the world. A lot of times, the story is very similar to Jesus and Christianity. So like, somehow these things got tied to Jesus in some way in his story. But he is a messianic figure, notably. Most of the figures or gods here, the savior figures, are actually born from virgin mothers, as Mithras was. Mithras was actually born on December 25th. Sol Invictus was born on December 25th, which we'll talk about in a little while. So there's a lot of overlap in some of these gods, I guess you could say. And it's because they come from different regions, but they're similar gods. Anyhow, they were secretive. You had to be invited to join, and then you were given secret knowledge. And so Christianity in the early days was also treated very similarly. So there's that. Usually brings on suspicion. You're not allowed to speak about the rituals and the things they do in the temples. So the bottom middle picture is actually a Mithraeum, which is the place, the space in which Mithras cult would do the rituals and meetings at. There's actually one that's open in, I want to say London, but I know it's in England, that you can go visit. They're reopening it, I think, for the summer. Anyhow, so little thing on mystery cults. There's a lot to learn here. If you want to get more into it, there's lots of books about this topic. So let's talk about Christianity and where sort of the problems of Judaism is taking place. And this map gives you Rome, the Roman Empire between 44 BCE and 117 CE. So notably between Julius Caesar being killed and Trajan's death. And Trajan, so you see the orangish color or yellowish orange color is like 44 BCE. They conquer the light green up to 14 CE, so by the end of Augustus's reign, this light green regions were all part of Rome. And then under Trajan, you see the dark green spaces that he added to the territory as well. But this is essentially the world in which Christianity comes about. So note that all these places are connected by the Mediterranean Sea, and with the rise of the Roman Republic and the Roman Empire, what we have is a very much a Mediterranean culture emerging, but that already started back when, during the Bronze Age, right? So like the internationalism that was taking place, a lot of similar cultural features emerged in all these places. So, but it actually, think about it, religion can spread very easily if it starts around a port city and spreads via port cities, as Christianity will. So Judea under the Roman Empire actually fell under Roman imperial control in 63 BCE. It was brought in by Pompey the Great. They set up a client king. Eventually, King Herod became the client king from 40 BCE to 4 BCE. And so, essentially, it was Roman indirect rule during this time period. Taxes and loyalty for autonomy. So Rome says, pay us, be loyal to us, and we'll let you be. But for the people, this was double taxation. They had to pay their state money, and they had to pay the Romans money. So you can see this would set, for many people, this would set the stage for revolts and revolutions. So basically there's a priestly class, and I want to break this up. So there's actually, during the 1st century BCE, Judaism had been splitting apart into multiple pieces. So there's different groups of people that were part of Judaism. So it wasn't one Judaism that existed. There was many. There were people that sort of were part of the priestly class that were based in the temple. These would have been the Sadducees and the Pharisees, and they had different things they thought were more important. So Sadducees believed that proper ritual, and following the law really closely, the Torah, is what was needed for the proper life, if you would. This is what Jews needed to do. The Pharisees believed in ethics and the covenant of God are the most important things. Although, in many ways, many people wouldn't think of the Pharisees as being very ethical, to be honest, but they tended to work with the Romans quite closely. And then there was other groups that broke off. One of these groups would be the Essenes. The Essenes, which many of them were known as Gnostics. This is too much to explain in a class like this, but if you're interested in it, I guess look it up. But the idea is withdrawal from public life into nature. It says people live in communities and share wealth And there's many there's many of these groups. One of these groups, many scholars believe, was Jesus and his Nazarenes. So there's a possibility that Christianity had to start with one of these groups, the Essene groups, that withdrew from society. And part of it's because a lot of the beliefs match up to the beliefs of these kind of Essene groups. The other group that broke off were the Zealots, and they believed in just revolution and taking over and following everything to a T in Judaism. So like very hardcore religious people. It's the best way to explain it, I suppose. So anyway, when a Jesus comes about, and really he's born sometime at the end of King Herod's reign, probably a little bit after, not the year zero, like many people like to say. So make sure you don't use that kind of idea. What else do I want to say about this? I think, oh yeah. So I think a few important things is that there would have been many people running around using the title Christos with their little groups that follow them. So Judaism was really breaking apart, but there had been a prophecy that a Messiah, a Christos is a title, would come about and save the Jews, basically. And so the Jesus idea fits into this, but so did many other people. So sometimes when the sources say the word Christos or Christus in Latin, they're not really talking about Jesus. It's not, well, they could be, but we're not absolutely sure they're talking about Jesus. They could be talking about someone else, because there was many. Anyway, so after the crucifixion, many of his disciples spread out and they brought gospels to other peoples, but they each had their own gospel. And so there's quite a few different gospels, and many that aren't used by, especially the really early ones, aren't used by the New Testament at all. And it's because they have contradictory messages or messages that didn't want to be passed down by, say, Romans that took over the religion. So Peter's important because it makes supremacy of man over woman. Another guy that's a really important disciple was Paul of Tarsus, who lived from 10 to 67 CE. Initially, he was a Jewish rabbi who was very hostile towards the Christians. Note that in the first century CE, no one ever called them Christians. And so the idea that Nero was against Christians is a problem because no one was using the word Christian around that time. People were they just called them Jews, especially Romans. So it tends to be, the stories tend to be problematic, but the history we have for, say, Nero is after there's an idea of Christianity existing. So sources aren't from the time period. Anyway, he was hostile towards Christians as heretics, but on a journey to try to round up the Christians in Damascus, he had a vision of Jesus, and then he became an ardent Christian missionary and contributed to several adjustments in Christian doctrine, very important ones for its spread. He did spend his last few years in jail, first in Roman-ruled Jerusalem and then in Rome itself. The Romans saw them as Jews and nothing else early on, as I mentioned earlier. The adjustments made by early Christian leaders drew even more converts. Paul, especially because he allowed non-Jewish people to join the group. And before that, they were only bringing on Jewish people. So this is an important moment in the spread of Christianity. Paul also encouraged more formal organization into a church system with local groups selecting elders to govern them. So soon after this, a single leader emerges as a bishop. And each major city would have a bishop appointed. So anywhere that has a Christian community would have a bishop appointed. The structure was actually paralleling the empire's provincial government. Finally, Christian doctrine became increasingly well organized as the writings of several disciples and others were collected into what would eventually become known as the New Testament, but not until the 300s. So quite some time afterwards. So Christianity gains a lot of ground in the 2nd and 3rd centuries. One thing that Jesus put forward, at least in the writings from the disciples, one concept was the ecclesia, Ecclesia just means assembly, and this would have been associated with the assembly. In Greek, it's associated with assemblies of, or democratic assemblies to get together and vote for citizen votes. But ecclesia becomes known as a church. So the word, kind of like the way we look at churches, is where ecclesia comes from, assembly. The picture on the left here is actually a church that was built later, but it's in Italy. But it's built on top of a house that was one of the original churches of Christianity in the 2nd century. So in 2nd century, there were no churches. I might say in the 3rd century, there's probably nothing like churches either. People met in private homes, and usually women led the discussion, which later on we know that that's not the true in Christianity. Matter of fact, women are not allowed in for the most part. So I also have a 2nd century bishop picture there for you. So it's one of the bishops of one city. And then the right picture is a depiction of Saint Perpetua. Perpetua was in Carthage, African Carthage, in the 202-203 CE, so early 3rd century. And she's one of the early martyrs. And it shows in that story that she was given many chances to not be killed, but she wants to be killed for the religion to help it spread. So many martyrs actually sought to be killed. They weren't trying to avoid it necessarily. Granted, martyrs aren't the majority of Christians either, so many Christians would have done the sacrifices to the imperial cult without problem. So let's get there. So how does Christianity universalize? A few things actually take place. The first thing I think we should mention is Diocletian and the Tetrarchy. So after the 3rd century crises, Diocletian is important because he didn't reunify the empire, but he stabilized the empire. So he passed a series of reforms, economic, money reforms. A lot of it could be seen as military reforms for the most part. But also, he divided up the entire Roman Empire into, I want to say, 32 dioceses, and also 4 major portions of the empire were turned into separate empires almost, but not really. So there's a bureaucracy, a hierarchy that exists. That Diocletian's on top. Gallienus is number 2 in the east. His number 2 man was Maximian, who ruled over the west. And then Constantius was made the Western Caesar, so below everyone. Constantius Chlorus is his name. All these guys are from a similar region and similar backgrounds. They all came up from very humble origins. They had success in the military and took power eventually. Well, Diocletian took power. And he granted these guys, so it was a 10-year sort of thing that came about. So first he brought Maximian on to deal with a Western revolt, and he became his number 2 man. And then he decided to add these Caesars to groom them. And so after 20 years, the Augusti, the senior emperors, would retire, and the junior emperors, the Caesars, would move up to their place, and new Caesar would be picked. Part of the idea was that no one would be hereditary, but this all broke down in the 2nd Tetrarchy. Everyone's pretty much related to one of these emperors. And then the system breaks down after that. So by the time Constantine, where is it? Oh yeah, I should probably mention the Great Persecution since I have it on here, 303 CE. Diocletian said to have ordered this Great Persecution, and actually the term Great Persecution comes from the Christian writings, of course, but it didn't. There was definitely systematic removal of Christians from positions that were close to the emperors, at least the emperor. So it happened more in the east than the west. The west didn't do much about this at all. But Diocletian was really targeting, he had many Christians working for him in his palace, looking to remove them from the military for the most part. And there's a whole slew of issues with Christians being in the military at this time because there's issues with them killing people and achieving their goals, so they might refuse to do the job. But the truth is there was very few Christians in the military at this time. Anyway. So Constantine came to power in 306 CE as the Western Caesar. He was raised up by German troops who had served under his father. But he would move on to start conquering the other emperors. And the first he conquers the Western Augustus in 312 CE at the Battle of Milvian Bridge. Supposedly he had a vision, according to Eusebius, he had a vision of Jesus and like this symbol in the sky, which is the Chi Rho. The Chi Rho is a symbol of Christ. It's a CHR in Greek. And so he put these on all of his shields for his soldiers, and supposedly, this was actually written after his death, so it has a lot of purpose behind Eusebius' writing, so there's a lot of problems with it. We'll talk about that in a second. After the Battle of Milvian Bridge, Constantine, with Licinius as the Eastern Augustus' name on it, put out a letter called the Edict of Milan. And the Edict of Milan basically says that monotheists could exist in the Roman Empire, so the law of toleration, and that any property or things taken from them should be given back. And the most important thing of the Edict of Milan probably is that it really advances the spread of Christianity because it allows money to flow into the building of churches. So once Constantine decides to conquer the East and kill Licinius, he moves as the capital, and Rome's not really the capital, by the way, at this time. It's more like Ravenna. So a different Roman city is really the more important city at this time. But anyway, he moves the capital of Constantinople, which is actually Byzantium. It's an ancient city-state. Goes way back. But a common thing in the 3rd century was to start renaming cities after you as you conquer a city, and you do that as your victory city. And so that's what it is. It's a victory city, Constantinople. And there's a lot of Christian symbology that shows up there, and this is one reason scholars tend to argue that Constantine's clearly a Christian. There's nothing that really clarifies his Christianness at all, besides what Eusebius tells us. Matter of fact, on the top right, our picture on the top right shows him with Sol Invictus on one side of his coin, so a non-Christian god is on his coinage. We should note that Sol Invictus was really popular with the soldiers, and these coins were paid to soldiers, so important political messages for both groups at the same time taking place. In 325 CE, Constantine called the Council of Nicaea. The Council of Nicaea was all the bishops gathering in one place and Constantine overseeing it. He noted that there was many fights between Christians and over belief, and they wanted to standardize beliefs and formalize the texts so we know which one's the right version, and so we can get rid of people that don't follow the right version, and to basically make it a universal church. And this is where the word Catholic comes from. It actually means universal in Greek. And this is where the idea of universalizing religions come from, actually, is this concept. So one argument is that this is all political moves for power, and I tend to be on this side more. And that, anyway, where was I going with that? So political moves for power, and that essentially he saw Christianity as more unified than the traditional religions because they're very decentralized. There's no formal, once again, unified pagan religion. So the people didn't really follow. It wasn't a unifying belief system, these traditional religions. And so you can unify the empire under this cross, basically, these symbols. So from there, we can think about our main histories of Constantine. The closest one to him is Eusebius, and Eusebius tells us he wrote the life of Constantine right after Constantine died. In many ways, it's more of what I talked about Exempla before, about Rome. it seems to be setting Constantine as an example of what emperors should be. Number one, they should be Christian. And so there's that. And so it's a panegyric, and so panegyrics are becoming very popular, especially in Christian writing. And they're like very extensive praise. So there's a lot of bias behind the sources. We have later sources we can check against Eusebius, but we have very few sources about Constantine within that time period. Lactantius, he really hates Diocletian. He's a Christian that was actually working for Diocletian in his palace. But he wrote sort of a rant in 315 CE, working from the court of Constantine. So we do have sources like that that can help maybe iron out some things. But you have to use a mix of archaeology and written material to figure these things out. So the next big step, and really a lot of Constantine's heirs were in fact Christian. Julian was not. So there's one more emperor that's not Christian that actually outlaws Christianity for a time and puts a bunch of money back into traditional religions. But he doesn't last that long. He's murdered. And the next big step, though, is Theodosius the Great, or the First. He came to power in the late 380s. In 393 CE, he made Nicene Christianity, which is the Christianity form that the Council of Nicaea decided on, the state religion of the empire. And so from this point forward, there was no more non-Christian sacrifices allowed. But interesting enough, still they're not going out and eradicating or killing off people that are not Christian. They're actually going out and doing more heretic persecutions, going after Arian Christians, people that don't believe in the Trinity. So Nicene Christianity sets the belief in the Trinity, Father, Son, Holy Ghost, all one substance, all made from each other. Whereas Arian Christians believe that Jesus was a prophet and nothing more, and there's one God and nothing else. And they viewed the Nicene Christianity very similar to how Islam views it later on, that Nicene Christians actually are polytheists that believe in three gods. So, anyhow. Many other forms of Christianity, people that follow them will flee the empire to the Persians and to other groups that are more accepting of them. Matter of fact, that's why there's many Christians that will live under the Islamic Empire later on, as more of these persecutions take place. So let's move on to the rise of Islam. And so basically this shows you how Islam spreads, but the thing is about Islam is it didn't spread as just a religion. It spread also as an empire. So this map shows the different stages of conquest by the Islamic State, Islamic Empire is really what we should be thinking of. But during the time of Muhammad, just this area here and the area by Oman were added to the empire. And then under the caliphs following him, more territory was added. And then by the Umayyad Caliph, the rest of the empire, including coming into contact with the Franks, which are Germanic peoples that live in Gaul. So they come into war with them, and they're the ones that stop them from spreading into Europe the rest of the way, besides Spain. So, first of all, let's talk about pre-Islamic Arabia, just like we talked about early Rome. We have groups of people known as Bedouin. They're around for a long time, really. I mean, they're people that they're really merchants, and they travel great distances to conduct trade. And essentially, they live in a clan structure that's made up of sheikhs, which are the chiefs or leaders, warriors, they have slaves. And so it's a very fragmented society. So we might be able to say these are like a series of micro-societies. There's different clans within even what we think of as Arabia, and there's a lot of interclan warfare, and this is one of the major problems that in some ways Muhammad goes out to fix in some ways. So early on, only Arabs embraced the religion of Islam, but from the outset it contained beliefs and practices that would give it a strong... I feel like I'm jumping ahead. Yeah, I'm jumping ahead. Sorry. So we'll talk about this from this as well. So Mecca was an important trading center. It was ran by the Umayyad clan in the Quraysh tribe. This is the tribe that Muhammad belonged to, although he was from a lesser segment of the families, so he wasn't really all that powerful of a person. They had something there called the Kaaba, which is still there. Very important site still today. But it had idols of many, many different gods, so they had a polytheistic religion that existed here, and the Kaaba was full of that. One of the things in the Kaaba is this black stone that's probably a meteorite, but it's sort of at the center of everything of worship of this place. In a place called Yathrib, which later on is known as Medina, many Jewish and Bedouin clans exist there, so together, coexist. And so when Medina becomes sort of a center of Islam, when Muhammad flees there, the Jewish beliefs, like even in Mecca, he would have come in contact with a lot of Jewish beliefs, and this is perhaps some of the reasons why he utilized, or, I mean, some people might think this is bad that I'm even saying it this way, but maybe this is some of the reasons why a lot of Judaic ideas come into play in Islam. Islam is one of the Judeo-Christian religions. It's in the same tradition. So the thing is, they see Jesus and some of the early, so even Abraham, they see them as just prophets, and there's one God. So in some ways, it's very similar to Aryan Christianity, at least the basics. Other factors that we should probably talk about maybe is women in marriage in pre-Islamic Arabia. So at a certain very young age, I want to say after 9, girls can actually select their own husband. This is true of pre-Islamic Arab peoples, and it's also true within the Quran. So women have a little more power. It's not exactly what you typically learn if you're in America, I suppose, about this religion. As a matter of fact, Muhammad married a wealthy widow, and so she was wealthy on her own right. So he married into money, more or less, if you would. She was a merchant family, and he did merchant things. So there's that. So let's go into the origins of Islam. So Muhammad was around from 570 to 632 CE, and I'm going to go through my notes on this actually, but keep in mind that the Quran wasn't written until close to 100 years after his death, so it took a while before it was actually written, which is typical of most religions. Usually the figure that's starting the religion never wrote a thing. So mostly Arabs would embrace this religion in the beginning, the very early years. Of course, it's only in Arabia, so it makes sense, but Jews didn't necessarily convert all too often, as far as we know. From the beginning, it contained beliefs and practices that would give it a strong appeal to the peoples at virtually all stages of social development in a widely varying cultural setting. Its potential as a world religion was enhanced by the fact that most of the attributes of Islam were to some degree anticipated by other Semitic religions, particularly Judaism and Christianity, which I already mentioned. So it's already sort of set up in a way that maybe Jews and Christians in this early times would actually understand it. It wasn't all that much of a proselytizing religion from the outset as well. So Muhammad accepted the validity of earlier divine revelations that had given the rise to Jewish and Christian faiths. He taught that the revelations he had received were a refinement of these earlier ones, and that they were the last divine instructions for human behavior and worship. And so I forgot to mention this about the other Gospels that exist, some of the Gospels that are included in the New Testament, but there's a sense of reformation between each of these religions. So like Judaism was breaking down. There was many fragmented versions of it, right? When we talked about Christianity coming about or like Jesus coming about. In a few texts, it's mentioned that Jesus came to fix the religion, not bring something new. So in other words, he's resetting the religion. And probably one of my more favorite lines from this is from the Gospel of Thomas. Gospel of Thomas is actually a set of, it's just a bunch of list of sayings, and I'll start with Jesus said. So this is what, Gospel of Thomas 16. Jesus said, "Men think perhaps that it is peace which I have come to cast upon the world. They do not know that it is dissension which I have come to cast upon the earth, fire, sword, and war. For there will be 5 in a house, 3 will be against 2, and 2 against 3. The father against the son, and the son against the father, and they will stand solitary." So, for instance, some Gospels are actually talking about how Jesus came to sort of break it down and actually make something new out of things. So, generally the other idea won out that he was here to fix Judaism, but ended up becoming something new over time. His disciples made something new. And because Judaism had gone off the tracks and needed a revision, well, Islam origins are really based on that Christianity has gone off the rails with all this Trinity nonsense and needs to be fixed. The believers went astray. And in his teachings, Muhammad pushes the idea that the revelations he was teaching that he received were a refinement of these earlier ones, Christianity and Judaism, and that they were the last divine instruction for human behavior and worship. No other ones will come after him. He's the last prophet. Pretty ingenious to come up with this idea in some ways. In addition to the beliefs and practices that have given Islam a universal appeal, its 5 pillars, principles that must be accepted and followed by all believers, provided the basis for an underlying religious unity. Each of the 5 pillars further connected the community of Muslims together, which allowed for its rise. So, as I kind of mentioned or pushed towards before, Islam more or less has a universal aspect to it right from the beginning. It's the body of law, the 5 pillars, and the concepts of afterlife. And on top of that, and so they're unifying things that are done. So fasting during Ramadan, there is no God but the one God. Muhammad's a prophet, not a God. The direction you pray towards, and actually praying towards Mecca is actually a newer concept. They used to pray towards Jerusalem in the old days. And then tithing for charity, the zakat, is required. And some charities, like there's a requirement for this society to take care of widows and also orphans, which Muhammad would have considered himself an orphan, so it makes sense. And his wife was a widow. And actually the allowances of multiple wives comes from that. If you can afford them, you can have multiple wives as a male in Islam. But the idea is that it allows for widows that have no way to make it to have a way in life. And the pilgrimage idea is another unifying concept. Got more screens than I thought. Well, what we know about Islam is that it will go on to, we'll have something called the Islamic Empire. So it's not just a religion, it's also a state, as I mentioned before. After many of the Bedouin tribes had converted to Islam, many of them renounced the new faith as soon as Muhammad died in 632, but his remaining followers quarreled over who should succeed Muhammad. Although these quarrels were never fully resolved, the community managed to find new leaders who directed a series of campaigns to force those who had abandoned Islam to return to the fold. The first four caliphs of the Islamic community are known as the Rashidun Caliphate. And actually, if we go back to our map, it's a little better screen for this. We see over here, it says the territory added by the first four caliphs. This is the Rashidun Caliphate. And this was Abu Bakr, 632 to 634. He reigned. Umar, who reigned 634 to 644. And then Uthman, he reigned 644 to 656. And then finally, Ali, who reigned 656 to 661. Notably, there's a lot of assassination in these first four, so that doesn't go well. Abu Bakr was already older. He was actually an uncle of Muhammad, so he's related to him. So some of the arguments come from this. Should it be people that are just close to him, or should it be people that were related to him that succeed him? So he had no succession plan put into place. So remember, all of our empires and territorial states and civilizations we've talked about, secession plans are one of the biggest problems in a political organization. The 29-year rule of the Rashidun was Islam's first experience without the leadership of the Prophet. His example, however, in both private and public life came to be regarded as the norm for his successors in a large influential body of companions of the Prophet. Kept a close watch on the caliphs to ensure their strict adherence to the Quran. Well, one problem is we should say the law, not the Quran, because the Quran wasn't written until a little bit later. These caliphs assumed all of Muhammad's duties except for the prophetic aspect. And as imams, they led the congregation in prayer at the mosque, they delivered the Friday sermons, then they commanded the army. So the Caliphate of Rashidun, in which virtually all actions had religious import, began with wars of the Rida, which took place between 632 and 633. They dealt with tribal uprisings in Arabia, and ended with the first Muslim civil war called the Fitna, 656 to 661, which we should recognize that Ali is a part of. And Ali represents a split in Islam. So the first split takes place because of Ali and the idea that it could be companions to Muhammad versus family members. And this is actually where you get Sunni and Shiite. So Ali followers become Shiites, and Sunni just means like conservative or traditional beliefs. But they follow the caliphs more so. Anyway, this affected the expansion of the Islamic State beyond Arabia into Iraq, Syria, Palestine, Egypt, Iran, Armenia, and with the development of an elite class of soldiers, Arab soldiers, I should say. The Rashidun created the Islamic calendar dating from Muhammad's immigration from Mecca to Medina in 622. And the establishment of the authoritative reading of the Quran, which strengthened the Muslim community and encouraged religious scholarship. A controversy over Ali's succession split, I already mentioned this, so I don't talk about it, which is the split that survives today, although the Shiites have split into more pieces, so there's more parts like Seveners and Twelvers, and there's Sufis, and there's a bunch of different groups of, there's many Islams today as a result, and through this period to now. So Muhammad had a lot of problems with the Umayyad clan for the most part, like the overall leadership and the higher-ups, but they ended up seizing leadership of the Muslim faithful and began a sequence of major conquests, and they added territory throughout the Middle East and North Africa. They actually moved the capital also to Damascus, so Syria became kind of the center of their empire. So and they were able to dominate the Persians and North Africa as well until a little bit later on. So the biggest thing, though, is a lot of this territory that's been cut out were much more sort of Arab unity versus Islamic unity for the most part. So still, when they conquered places, they weren't forcing people to become Arabs. That's something that's like a misconception, or become Arabs, become Islamic or Muslims. They were actually not wanting people to convert. They wanted to keep the religion more pure. But they allowed people of the book to live within their communities, so known as the dhimmi. Those are the people of the book. So Jews and Christians were allowed to be here. They just paid an extra tax to be there. But the upside for them is they never had to fight in wars either. So they didn't provide anything themselves for the wars that were taking place, of these conquests. So Umayyad decline and fall. The ever-increasing size of the royal harem was just one manifestation of the Umayyad Caliph's growing addiction to luxury and soft living. Their legitimacy had been disputed by various Muslim factions since their seizure of the caliphate, but the Umayyads further alienated the Muslim faithful as they became more aloof in the early 8th century and retreated from conquest. So they started settling in, kind of keeping their borders where they're at. Which the downside is, if you're a soldier, you kind of fall into not making any more money. You have to find a new way of life. Their abandonment of the frugal, simple lifestyle followed by Muhammad and the earliest caliphs led to an uprising that began among the frontier warriors who had fought and settled in distant Iran. These warriors were mostly treated as sort of second-class citizens. This is another issue, is that they had to fight for the... So like non-Arab soldiers that were converted to Islam, they weren't treated at the same level as others, and they ended up rising up against the state. By the mid-8th century, more than 50,000 warriors had settled in the Iranian borderlands of the empire. Many of them had married local women, and over time they had become to identify with the region and to resent the dictates of governments sent out from distant Damascus. The warrior settlers were also angered by the fact that they were rarely given the share of the booty they were supposed to get, or plunder supposed to get, now officially tallied in the account books of the royal treasury, that they had earned by fighting the wars of expansion and defending the frontiers. So they had contempt for the Umayyads and the Damascus elite, whom they saw as corrupt and decadent. In the early 740s, an attempt by Umayyad palace officials to introduce new tribes into the region, it's called Merv. It's actually up here by Afghanistan. Touched off a revolt that soon spread over much of the eastern portions of the empire. Marching under the black banners of the Abbasid party, and the black banners that here's, I guess, a little interesting fact is that the black banners that you might think of, and if you saw them, you would think ISIS immediately. So ISIS actually adopted flags that were more similar to this older, the Abbasids, essentially. So they have very much a nationalist movement that's not going well for them anyhow, but they're causing a lot of chaos and problems. But anyway, the Abbasid party had the black banners of Islam. And they traced their descent from Muhammad's uncle Al-Abbas. This is what they call themselves, Abbasids. The frontier warriors openly challenged the Umayyad armies by 747 CE, and they forged alliances with dissident groups that resisted the Umayyads throughout the empire. Their leader, Abu al-Abbas, the great-great-grandson of the Prophet's uncle, led his forces from victory to victory. Among his important allies was the Shia, who, as we have seen, had rejected Umayyad authority quite some time ago. They're also critical were the Mawali, or non-Arab converts to Islam. The Mawali felt that under Umayyad rule they had never been recognized as full Muslims. In supporting the Abbasids, the Mawali hoped to attain full acceptance in the community of believers. The diverse collection of Muslim rebels made short work of what remained of the Umayyad Imperium. Persia and then Iraq fell to the rebels in 750. The Abbasid forces met an army led by the Umayyad Caliph himself in the major battle of the river Zab near the Tigris River. The Abbasid victory opened the way for the conquest of Syria and the capture of the Umayyad capital. wanting to eliminate the Umayyad family altogether to prevent recurring challenges to his rule. Abu al-Abbas invited many members of the clan to what was styled as a reconciliation banquet. So he invited them all to a banquet, and as the Umayyads were enjoying the feast, guards covered them with carpets, and they were slaughtered by Abbas's troops. An effort then was made to hunt down and kill the remaining members of the family throughout the entire empire. Most were slain, but the grandson of a former caliph fled to Spain and founded there what later became the Umayyad Caliphate of Cordoba, which lived on for centuries after the rest of the Umayyad Empire had disappeared. The Abbasids enjoyed great wealth and were very important, as the city of Baghdad was built actually by them, and it became a city that was very important for the advancement of learning and innovation. So they're extremely important for knowledge that Europeans will get later, almost returned to them, if you would. Another group split off called the Fatimids, and they're going to found a city called Cairo, which you should all probably know already. And actually they found the first university in the way we think of universities. They were actually a faction of Shiites that were adherents to Muhammad's daughter's line of descendancy. They founded their own dynasty in Egypt and built Cairo as their capital. The end of this dynasty was a Mamluk invasion. So Mamluks came in and conquered them. Mamluks are Turkish people, a Turkish tribe. While Baghdad's end came in 1258 CE with the Mongol invasions. So the Mamluks kept the Mongols out of Egypt, but they would eventually succumb to the Ottoman Turks, eventually. Now, I know this video is getting longer than I like to say that I was making them, but I wanted you to keep in mind that I actually put together 3 lectures into one and cut out a lot of material. So I hope it's okay. Finally, I want to talk about the spread of Buddhism. And my screen got messed up. And talk about spread from India into China, Korea, and Japan. So first, China, and we should mention, once again, I'll bring it, I think I mentioned this earlier, but in the Chandragupta, the Mauryan Empire, I should say, there was Ashoka who actually universalized Buddhism and made it, in a sense, he universalized it. He didn't actually reset the standards of like belief or make some kind of unified system of belief, though. So that's one issue. So he didn't necessarily universalize it, he just used it as a religion, as a state religion, without making any major changes to it. Anyhow, to get into China, Buddhism had to change a bit. So I think I put some stuff on here that I already talked about. I'm not going to talk about it again, but Han Dynasty obviously was really based on legalism and Confucianism, traditional Chinese ideals, although revamped by a foreigner. The Three Kingdoms period, we just say chaos and fragmentation of the state. Group called the Sui Dynasty brought everything back together, at least from 581 to 618 CE. They built the Grand Canal to the south, and this increased the flow of ideas from the southern portion of China, but also from India into the main part of China, the North China Plain. Increased trade, increased ideas flowing in. So, in the Tang Dynasty, and I'm not going to go through the whole story, but there's an interesting character. I mean, all sources are really negative towards her. She's virtually hated by whoever wrote about her, but a character emerges named Empress Wu, and she's reigning from 624 to 705 CE. So not long after the Tang Dynasty took over, she gains control. Female Empress in complete, absolute ruler. A few things happens. She brings Buddhism into the state because, number one, Buddhism has kind of an equality message in it. Women could actually worship, although early on it did not. But by this time it did. And so it could explain why a woman is in power. However, there was some linguistic problems, like the actual language of Buddhism and the concepts of Buddhism does not translate well into Chinese. And so what happened is they used Dao, or Taoist principles to equate to Buddhism. So in many ways, it's sort of a Taoist form of Buddhism that shows up in China. Another factor is that she claims that she's the incarnation of Maitreya, who's a bodhisattva. There's a statue of Maitreya on this, actually. Slide to the right. The top right corner is actually Empress Wu when she's older. She rules for a pretty good amount of time, notice. So the trade seems to have flourished. A lot of people, Korea and Japan seek to copy and emulate Tang China and government structure and religion. So she must have been pretty successful, actually, despite what's said about her. Maitreya is important to think about because she's the one bodhisattva. So bodhisattvas, I think your book probably explains it. I'm pretty sure you already read about this, but bodhisattva are these sort of Buddhas that are born after Buddha. So the idea is that these important figures will be born and they will make things better in the world for the most part. That's the basic concept. Maitreya is one that is different because she brings about chaos in the end of the world with her birth and return. So in some ways, I mean, some people might be like it's very similar to Christianity, but it's not based on Christianity. There's no good, nothing would illustrate that in terms of evidence, but it might sound similar to some people. So there's a mix of Mahayana Buddhism and Taoism. It said Taoism here, but Taoism. And to bring it into China, the other issue that you have to get around, this is one of the reasons why you have to also use a lot of Taoist language, is that China has always had an anti-foreign view of the world. And so foreign things are bad. They hate foreign things. Although foreign people keep taking over and ruling over the country, they at least act Chinese when that happens. So Tang Dynasty lasts a while. They last till 907 CE, when another Zhou group rises. Not the same group, actually, but the same name. And then after that, we have the Mongols come. Sorry. So let's move on to Korea and Buddhism. So in Korea, there's actually multiple states. What's Korea today? So Pyongyang, which is the North Korean capital today, is part of a group called the Goguryeo. In the south, though, we have Paekche, Kaya, and Silla. Interesting enough, the Silla are going to rise and conquer everyone else, but with the help of the Chinese, the Tang Dynasty. So they're going to very much copy the Tang Dynasty. They're going to adopt Buddhism, the same version of Buddhism that's in China. And they make an alliance with Tang to conquer everyone else. And then they're successful. And they last from 57 BCE all the way to 967 CE. Note that people had been in Korea. So Korea goes way back. It's prehistorical before the Silla. But people passed through probably here to go. So those Austro-Indonesian speaking peoples went from here to Taiwan to Japan to other islands. And then another group rose in 935 to 1392 CE, which is much longer lasting. They will overthrow the Silla, and they're called the Koryo Dynasty. And this is where the word Korea comes from, actually, is the Koryo Dynasty. They're a militant regime. They have Confucian influence, but Buddhism remains strong throughout the rule. And on our pictures here, we have our modern international boundaries of the map. They're actually on there, but at the same time, it shows you where the territories are at for these several states. And then here we have, it's built into a mountain. It's a pretty interesting building, but it's a temple to Buddha, and it's perfectly symmetrical. Anyway, it's a pretty amazing feat of construction, so it's pretty interesting building. But it shows sort of the importance of Buddhism there, but also the depiction of Buddha and the temple shows that in Korea, the animism and the earlier religions of Korea actually merged in with Buddhism. So in each place we get kind of a local flavor to Buddhism in that way. They try to copy the Tong, but they add a little Korean spice to it, if you would. Not to say that's messed up sounding, but if it is, I'll just say we add a little Korean features to it. In Japan, really long history. Prehistoric artifacts start around 10,000 BCE, actually. But when we come into writings, into actual historical documents, there's a clan-based society, family-based society. But the most powerful group in Japan is the Yamato clan, centered around, I believe, Kyoto, the city of Kyoto. And so in all of Japan, there's this thing called kami, not C-O-M-M, like a communist, but K-A-M-I. And these are like goddesses that represent some kind of natural feature for the most part. It's part of Shintoism beliefs, which is sort of their animistic earlier religion. So the prehistoric to early historic religion here is actually Shintoism. So the most important goddess, essentially, or kami to the Yamato clan is Amaterasu, who's a sun goddess. She's depicted on the upper right picture. And so what we get in Japan when Buddhism does come in, Buddhism actually comes in very differently from other places and here. But we get is a lot of depictions of sun Buddhas, and actually there's a sun Buddha to the bottom right, so it was very different looking, but always depicted with the sun around him. And sometimes the Buddha is depicted as a woman, so it's the Amaterasu influence taking hold with that. So, first of all, in Korea and China, when Buddhism spread to these places, it went straight. So it was implemented by the top. In China, they certainly made specific rules to it that they're going to follow and adapt it to Chinese culture. And so that's the universal factor of Buddhism in China. But in Korea, because the Silla wanted to be, and actually I believe it said Shilla, so I'm sorry if I mispronounced that. It should be Shilla. They wanted to be connected with the Tang dynasty, so the rulers brought in Buddhism the same as there because they wanted to get an alliance to conquer everyone else. But in Japan, Shintoism was really like the imperial religion, and many merchants that traveled here from India and from Korea and from China actually followed the religion. So it was sort of a sailor's religion. And the form that shows up in Japan is actually Zen Buddhism. It's a little bit different. I'm not going to explain all the differences, but you can. It's something good to look up if you want to learn more about it. There's a lot of different weird, kind of odd texts that are associated with it that many students would probably hate reading. But anyway, it's interesting anyhow. It's very philosophical. So anyway, Buddhism spread into the merchant territories in the south first, and then eventually there was a prince that wanted to adapt it to the imperial religion. And so it very much mixed with the local deities and the shamanistic religion that existed there already. So Shintoism and Buddhism, you put the two together and you get sort of the version of Japan. So it was eventually brought in by a ruling class that utilized the current religion aspects, so synchronized it with the current religions in the region to make it something people would follow. I do want to talk about the Heian period from 794 to 1184 CE. It's a big chunk of Japanese history. But this is where Chinese influence was at its height in Japan. And Buddhism and Taoism flowed into the regions. This is the period when it actually happened. Some of the most important aspects of this period is actually appearance and decorum, so acting in the proper way. And we actually have a really elaborate text. It's called the Diary of Lady Murasaki. There's a depiction of a manuscript on the right bottom, and there's a picture of the modern, I think, Penguin edition of the book. So it exists today. And it explains court life from a woman's perspective very clearly and what the Heian period would have been like. So we do have that kind of literature. There's actually, I usually show it in my classes sometimes. I don't know, it's kind of goofy, but there's a history of Japan in a couple minutes type thing video. When you search history of Japan on YouTube, you'll come across it. But it runs through, actually, as goofy as it is and jokey, all the jokes it throws out there, it's a fairly accurate, very quick history of Japan. So if you want to learn more about Japan, that might be a way to look at it. Anyway, I think that'll be it. And I just want to make sure you guys understand that this whole purpose of this, once again, was to show how religion was before. And it was used for somewhat ruling purposes, but at the same time, there was no universal religion, that concept of universal religion, really pre-Christianity, other than Ashoka's use of Buddhism, perhaps. There was an attempt in the Gupta, this is CE period though, in the Gupta Empire to use Hinduism as a universal religion, but there was a lot of problems. It didn't really work, so all that well. Especially because it cemented class system into society, and people were not feeling good about that. So Buddhism was sort of winning out among some of the population for those reasons. So essentially, when we say universal religions, we're talking about standardizing the rules and the traditions and the belief system, and more or less enforcing those systems, and usually applying it to the rule of a state, so as a state religion. And the idea is you're creating a unifying substance for that state. So think about, I know people want to be like, oh, what about nationalism or something? But nationalism is a completely modern concept that did not exist in these days. I feel like the closest thing to nationalism you might see is if you looked at Roman Republic, maybe, but it's hard to come by, this idea of nationalism. So that didn't really exist until really the late 18th or early 19th century. All right, that's it for this week. I think you just have your discussion board left, which is going to be focused on this topic, really.